Tonight, we drive into the backroads of central Texas in the summer of 1966, where cicadas scream from the trees, dust hangs thick in the headlights, and teenagers vanish into the night without warning. At the edge of a lonely field, police found two boys dumped like discarded clothes. Their lives ended in the dark. A few miles away, a broomstick lay snapped in the weeds, silent witness to a cruelty too deliberate to be called chance. The name, whispered with dread, wasn't the victim's. It was the predator's. Kenneth McDuff. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't desperate. He was a spoiled son of family who believed rules bent around money. And he grew up treating people the way others treat scraps of paper, crumpled, tossed aside, forgotten. McDuff didn't stumble into violence. He cultivated it. And every time society tried to cage him, he wriggled free, grinning as if the world itself were his accomplice. The police called him a killer. Texas called him a shame. But history remembers him as something worse. The rich kid who turned cruelty into a career and forced us to wonder how many lives would have been spared of justice had been stronger than arrogance. The final cigarette burned down to ash between his fingers, the smoke curling upward like a ghost desperate to escape. The man holding it, Kenneth McDuff, was not desperate. He was calm, too calm, and it was that calmness, that chilling detachment, that made hardened guards whisper his name with a kind of disgust usually reserved for things crawling out of swamps. Moments before his execution, McDuff leaned toward the microphone, not to apologize, not to explain, but to smirk through the glass at a system he'd mocked for decades. Some men go to their end begging for forgiveness, some clinging to God like children grabbing their mother's skirts. McDuff, he leaned back, inhaled one last breath of prison air, and muttered words so unnervingly mundane, they cut deeper than confession. I'm ready. No trembling voice, no cracked emotion, just flat indifference, like he was talking about turning off a light switch. That was Kenneth McDuff, born into money, privilege, and a comfortable Texas town. Yet he walked the earth as if it owed him a theater for cruelty. He was a son who could do no wrong, the boy protected by his family's wealth, the teenager who learned early that connections could erase consequences. He was a lesson in how luxury doesn't always polish the soul. Sometimes it builds the perfect armor for a predator. McDuff's story isn't a carnival sideshow of violence. It's a terrifying study of what happens when society, blinded by class and connections, lets a wolf grow fangs unchecked. Imagine a spoiled kid given the keys to a kingdom of indulgence, only to use those keys to unlock cages he should never have touched. Every crime he committed, every life he snuffed out, was drenched not in necessity, but in a kind of sport, a grotesque rebellion against boredom. And this isn't a tale that ends neatly. This isn't a villain plucked from the shadows by justice. In the first act, McDuff slithered through cracks in the justice system, so wide you could drive a Cadillac through them. He killed, was caught, sentenced to death, then released and killed again. Yes, released. Texas handed him back to the world like a defective toy returned to a shelf. The hook isn't just his cruelty. It's the horrifying reality that society had multiple chances to stop him and didn't. When McDuff said, "I'm ready," he wasn't just speaking to the needle waiting in his arm. He was mocking us, mocking the families who had begged for protection, mocking the idea that justice is supposed to be final. Because for Kenneth McDuff, the execution chamber was the first time the world finally meant it. Central Texas in the 1940s and 50s. Oil money dripping through towns like Waco and Rosebud. Family names carrying more weight than the law itself. It wasn't glamorous like Hollywood's golden age. It wasn't gritty like New York's crime alleys. No, Texas was its own strange ecosystem. Wide highways slicing through farmland, Friday night football games where entire counties shut down, and a cultural cocktail of church hymns on Sunday morning, followed by good old boy backroom deals on Monday. This is where Kenneth McDuff was born in 1946. His hometown of Rosebud was the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than the mailman, but where wealth could silence gossip just as quickly. McDuff's family wasn't Rockefeller-level rich, but they had enough land, connections, and stubborn clout to make sure their son rarely faced real consequences. In Texas at that time, boys from families like his were expected to inherit, not to be punished. If he acted out, well, boys will be boys. If he got caught, there was always someone who knew his father, his uncles, or his family's name. But the world around Rosebud was shifting. Post-war America was a place of contradictions. The economy was booming, yet the rural poor still scraped by with almost nothing. Suburbia was rising, but so were tensions over civil rights. And behind the white picket fences of small-town Texas, there was a darker truth. Just as often it had less to do with morality and more to do with who could afford the better lawyer, the bigger bribe, or the louder influence. It's no accident that McDuff flourished in this environment. He was a product of it. The type of society where appearances mattered more than character, where young men were rewarded for arrogance if it came packaged with confidence, and where cruelty could be mistaken for strength if you delivered it with the right swagger. Kenneth didn't just learn that rules could be bent. He learned that, for the right kind of family, rules practically didn't exist. And in Texas culture, where masculinity was measured in aggression and dominance, McDuff's violent streak wasn't treated as alarming at first. It was almost encouraged. Get into a fight? He was tough. Bully someone weaker? He was just showing leadership. Small-town life blurred cruelty into charm, as long as you had the right pedigree. Picture the backdrop. Teenagers drag racing down dusty farm roads, beer cans clinking in the backs of pickups, sheriffs looking the other way because the boys in trouble were sons of men who owned half the land in town. That was the stage upon which Kenneth McDuff grew up. A stage set not for rehabilitation or morality, but for entitlement and arrogance to metastasize unchecked. The soil was fertile, and Kenneth, already restless, already greedy for control, was exactly the kind of seed that would grow into something monstrous. Kenneth Allen McDuff. Let's not pretend his name doesn't already sound like the villain in a paperback thriller left on a bus stop bench. But in Rosebud, Texas, he wasn't introduced as a villain. He was introduced as the baby of the McDuff family, the kid who could do no wrong because his mother decided he wouldn't do wrong. She wrapped him in armor forged not from discipline, but from indulgence. Teachers who dared complain about Kenneth's behavior found themselves berated by his mother. Neighbors whispering about his cruelty learned quickly that gossip about a McDuff could get you socially exiled. And here's the chilling part. Kenneth learned this dynamic early. He discovered that his bad behavior didn't bring punishment. It brought excuses. He wasn't disciplined for cruelty. He was defended for it. He wasn't stopped for being destructive. He was shielded. That's not just enabling. That's manufacturing a monster in real time. By his teenage years, Kenneth was already displaying the psychological cocktail of traits that later true crime textbooks would outline like a grim checklist. Lack of empathy, delight in domination, compulsive lying, and a hunger for power that felt bigger than his small-town world. He wasn't content with simply being bad. He wanted to own the fact that he was feared. Classmates remembered him as the bully who took things too far, who didn't just shove someone in the hallway, but enjoyed watching them scramble to pick up their books afterward. This wasn't rebellion. This wasn't the archetypal wild kid burning off steam. Kenneth was deliberate. His aggression was calculated. His contempt sharpened like a blade, where other boys might laugh off a prank. McDuff seemed to stare longer, waiting for the discomfort to sink in. There's a term criminologists use, the mask of normalcy. Many predators wear flawlessly, blending into society until the mask cracks. McDuff? He barely wore the mask at all. He wasn't polished. He wasn't charming in that slick, Ted Bundy way. No, his power didn't come from deception. It came from brazenness, from the terrifying awareness that he didn't have to hide, because no one around him would stop him. That's the rot at the heart of McDuff's character. He grew up not as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but as a wolf raised in a town that kept insisting he was just a misunderstood sheep. And if society insists a wolf is harmless long enough, the wolf will eventually believe it's untouchable. Kenneth McDuff wasn't simply rich or spoiled. He was what happens when arrogance and cruelty are rewarded at every stage of development. By the time he was a young man, he wasn't wondering whether he could get away with something terrible. He was wondering how far he could go before someone finally tried to stop him. It was August 1966, the kind of Texas summer where the air itself feels heavy, and even cicadas seem to scream out of exhaustion. Kenneth McDuff was 20 years old, lanky, mean-eyed, and armed with the confidence of a man who had never truly been told no. On that sweltering night, he climbed into a car with his accomplice, Roy Dale Green. Two young men, restless, prowling for something to puncture the boredom. But McDuff wasn't bored. He was hunting. Their victims were completely ordinary. Teenagers like any others, doing what teenagers did, driving down quiet country roads, leaning into the kind of freedom that comes with youth. Robert Brand, his cousin Mark Dunman, and Robert's girlfriend, Edna Sullivan, probably thought the night would end in laughter, maybe a milkshake, maybe just a hum of tires on blacktop. Instead, they stumbled into the orbit of Kenneth McDuff, and their fates were sealed. McDuff's cruelty didn't explode suddenly. It unfurled slowly, with the precision of someone who had been imagining this moment for years. First, the boys were forced into the trunk of the car, the lid slamming down like a coffin door. Darkness, air growing thinner, fear pressing into their chests. Then Edna, just 16 years old, was dragged out. McDuff's choice wasn't random. It was ritualistic. He craved domination, and this was his first real chance to stage it. The killing of Robert and Mark was efficient, almost clinical. 2 gunshots. Bodies dumped like trash along a dusty road. But with Edna, McDuff displayed what set him apart from the common criminal. He didn't just take a life, he staged it. He used her as an instrument of fear, degrading her, binding her, and then tightening a broomstick across her throat until her struggling finally went still. The method was cruel, but the symbolism was worse. McDuff wasn't just ending a life. He was broadcasting his contempt for it. This was a disturbance, the moment where Kenneth McDuff crossed the threshold from menace to predator. It's easy in hindsight to label it the beginning, but that would be naive. This wasn't his first cruelty. It was simply the first time the world could no longer deny what he was. 3 young people died that night in August. Their names might have blurred into the background of Texas history, if not for the bizarre trajectory of the man who killed them. Because while justice caught up to McDuff quickly after this massacre, what came next was even more grotesque. The justice system itself will become his accomplice. The aftermath of that August night should have been simple. 3 kids murdered, a killer caught, justice delivered, open and shut. But nothing about Kenneth McDuff would ever be simple, and nothing about the justice system handling him would ever be straightforward. What followed wasn't just a trial. It was a grotesque dance between law, privilege, and the sheer audacity of a man who knew he could bend the rules until they snapped. McDuff was arrested within days. The evidence was overwhelming. His accomplice, Roy Dale Green, quickly confessed and detailed a nightmare in chilling clarity. The victim's family sat in court, hearing about how their children's final moments were reduced to a broomstick and a trunk, the stuff of horror novels. And yet, even as the courtroom filled with grief, something unsettling hovered in the air. Kenneth's complete lack of fear. Most men facing the electric chair would show cracks, sweat, trembling hands, frantic whispers to their lawyers. McDuff smirked. He sat with the same bored expression he'd worn in rosebud classrooms, like a kid half listening to a lecture he thought was beneath him. That look unsettled jurors, unsettled reporters, unsettled anyone who expected remorse. But the real mystery wasn't his lack of emotion, it was how the system responded. Because here's the twist. Kenneth McDuff was sentenced to death. Justice seemed swift. Families exhaled. Texas had spoken. But then the United States Supreme Court in the early 1970s complicated everything. In Furman versus Georgia, the court ruled against arbitrary death penalties, effectively halting executions nationwide. For many, this meant life sentences instead of death. For McDuff, it meant possibility. A door cracked open, and a man like him only needed a sliver of light to crawl through. And crawl he did. His sentence was commuted to life. Life, when 3 lives had been snuffed out. Suddenly, the families who thought justice had been sealed were forced to sit through parole hearings, forced to hear arguments about rehabilitation, forced to listen as lawyers painted McDuff as a man capable of reform. Reform. Kenneth McDuff. The 2 words don't even belong in the same sentence, but bureaucracy has a way of pairing impossibilities together. As the years stretched on, parole board shuffled his file like it was paperwork, not a death sentence deferred. And here's where the real horror sets in, not just that McDuff killed, but that the machinery meant to stop and began, slowly, to let him slip loose. The mystery deepened not in his crimes, but in the quiet absurdity of a system that would even consider giving Kenneth McDuff a second chance at freedom. It wasn't a question of whether he'd kill again. It was a question of when, and Texas, whether it realized it or not, was winding the clock. The parole board didn't free Kenneth McDuff in one bold stroke. It chipped away at the walls that should have kept him buried. By the late 1970s and 1980s, overcrowded prisons in Texas became their own kind of courtroom. Justice wasn't decided by juries anymore. It was decided by space, by bed counts, by paperwork piling up on desks. And McDuff, with his lawyered-up confidence and his family still whispering favors behind closed doors, slid through. When he walked out of prison in 1989, it wasn't greeted with outrage. It was met with shrugs. Overcrowding, officials muttered. Nonviolent record inside. Nonviolent. That's what they called a man who had bound and strangled a teenager with a broomstick. Because inside the prison walls, McDuff didn't cause trouble. He saved it all for the outside. Theories swirl around this decision like vultures over a carcass. Some argue the parole board was willfully blind, convinced that time had dulled his cruelty. Others whisper about the political climate. Texas trying to appear efficient, cutting costs, making numbers work. But the darker theory, the one that lingers like a bad taste, is that McDuff knew exactly how to play the system. He didn't act out in prison. He kept his violence on a leash, knowing that quiet behavior earned stamps of approval. The predator learned patience, waiting for the cage to open. And when it did, the results were catastrophic. Investigators later tied McDuff to a string of disappearances across central Texas. Young women vanishing from parking lots, gas stations, lonely stretches of road. Their bodies often weren't found until much later, if at all. The pattern was chilling. McDuff hunted in plain sight, as if daring the system to catch him again. Law enforcement scrambled. Tips poured in. But this wasn't 1966 anymore. McDuff had adapted. He changed cars frequently, traveled across counties, picked victims no one would miss quickly enough. Some investigators began to whisper that McDuff had grown bolder, not despite being caught once, but because of it. He'd stared into the machinery of justice, walked out alive, and now believed himself untouchable. Theories about his motives range from the banal to the monstrous. Some frame it as simple compulsion, a man who couldn't resist his violent urges. Others paint a darker portrait, That McDuff killed because he enjoyed proving the world wrong, enjoyed demonstrating, over and over, that no matter how many times it was caught, he could always come back. It's almost absurd to frame it as mystery, because the truth was obvious. Kenneth McDuff was a predator released back into a field of sheep. The real puzzle was why the shepherds, the courts, the parole boards, the so-called guardians of justice, opened the gate. The tipping point came with a young woman named Colleen Reed. It was December 1989, just weeks before Christmas, and she was washing her car at a self-service station in Austin. A normal night, ordinary as dust. Then a witness saw something strange. A tall man forcing Reed into his car. The abduction happened in public view, under buzzing fluorescent lights. It was brazen, reckless. Yet McDuff pulled it off as if he were simply running an errand. That abduction was the beginning of McDuff's unraveling, though not immediately. For years, her disappearance lingered as one of many unsolved cases linked to him. Meanwhile, more women vanished. Valencia Joshua in 1991, Melissa Northrup in 1992. Each case tightened the noose, but slowly, painfully, as if the justice system was afraid of pulling too hard. The real breakdown came not from law enforcement brilliance, but from McDuff himself. He grew sloppy. He used credit cards stolen from victims, left traces in motel rooms, bragged to acquaintances about things too gruesome to be idle talk. It was arrogance, pure and simple. The same arrogance that had carried him through rosebud classrooms and parole boards now made him careless. Investigators finally caught up with him in May 1992, after Northrup's disappearance. By then, McDuff had become the FBI's most wanted fugitive, his face plastered across newspapers and TV screens. The predator who once smirked through trials was now hiding in Louisiana under an alias, working at a trash compactor plant. When marshals stormed and McDuff didn't fight, he just muttered, "I guess you got me." Anticlimactic words from a man who once thought himself untouchable. And here's the breakdown, not his but the system's. The turning point wasn't his capture. It was a horrifying realization of how many lives had been lost because he was released in the first place. Families of victims didn't celebrate. They demanded answers. How did a convicted triple murderer, a man once sentenced to die, walk free to kill again? The answer wasn't satisfying. Overcrowded prisons, political deals, bureaucratic blindness. In short, a system too tired to notice it was feeding people to a predator. That breakdown of justice was more chilling than any individual crime, because it proved McDuff wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. Once McDuff was back in custody, Texas seemed determined to erase its earlier mistake with sheer force. Trials unfolded like grim theater. In 1992, he was convicted of killing Melissa Northrup, a young mother abducted from the convenience store where she worked. Jurors didn't deliberate long. His history, his arrogance, his trail of victims left little room for doubt. This time, there would be no parole, no overcrowding loophole, no second chances. He was sentenced to die again. But even then, the lingering questions poisoned the air. How many victims were there really? Officially, McDuff is tied to a handful of murders, but investigators whisper about a tally stretching into the dozens. Women who disappeared off lonely highways. Students last seen outside laundromats. Bodies found in ditches. Others never found at all. Some cold cases remain unsolved to this day. Shadows that look suspiciously like his work. And why did he kill? Was it compulsion? Control? Revenge against a society that once dared to cage him? McDuff rarely offered clarity. In prison interviews, he gave flat, dismissive answers, as if the murders were trivial details in a life otherwise wasted. He hinted at more victims, then pulled back, enjoying the power of withholding the truth. For him, even silence was another form of dominance. The most haunting question, though, circles back to the justice system. McDuff should have been executed in the 1960s. Instead, he was released in 1989. Between those 2 points stretched decades of bureaucratic excuses, political cowardice, and systemic collapse. Families who lost daughters in the 90s were left with cruel truth. Their loved ones might still be alive if the system had simply held the line. Resolution came on November 17, 1998, in the death chamber at Huntsville Unit. McDuff was strapped to the gurney, needles in his arms, reporters watching from behind the glass. Did he confess? No. Did he beg? No. Shrewd of form, his final act was indifference. Asked for last words, he muttered something barely audible. Some accounts say it was, "I'm ready." Others swear he said nothing at all. Either way, the silence was heavier than any admission. But even as the chemicals flowed and his chest stilled, the lingering questions didn't vanish. They still hang in the air more than 2 decades later. How many victims will never have names? How many families never knew who stole their daughters? And how many other McDuffs are waiting, hidden in plain sight, shielded by loopholes and blind bureaucracy? Kenneth McDuff's death did not close a chapter. It tore open a file cabinet no one wanted to look inside. Texas, a state that prided itself on being tough on crime, was forced to face the embarrassing reality that it had unleashed a serial predator into its own backyard. The fallout was seismic. Legislators scrambled to patch the cracks McDuff had slithered through, drafting new laws to ensure violent offenders couldn't walk free simply because the prisons were too full. It wasn't just about McDuff anymore. His name became shorthand for systemic failure. Parole hearings across the state shifted from quiet bureaucratic routines to arenas of fear, where families clutched photographs of murdered children and screamed that another McDuff would not be allowed to happen. His case fueled the construction of new prisons, expanded death row, and hardened parole boards into near impenetrable fortresses. But there was another legacy, too, one carved into the hearts of ordinary Texans. For years after McDuff's execution, women in Central Texas admitted they drove differently at night. They checked their rear-view mirrors more often. Parents told their daughters to stay in groups, to avoid deserted parking lots, to keep their keys clutched like weapons between their fingers. Kenneth McDuff was gone, but the paranoia he created remained, a shadow stretching across generations. Law enforcement also carried scars. Investigators who worked his cases described sleepless nights, haunted by the faces of women whose bodies they never recovered. They spoke bitterly about watching McDuff smirk during interrogations, refusing to give closure by naming his other victims. Some officers admitted that his very existence changed how they approached every disappearance thereafter. No case was just a runaway anymore. McDuff had taught them how easy it was for a predator to operate in plain sight. And then there's the cultural imprint. McDuff isn't remembered with the grim, mythic aura of other killers. He isn't wrapped in mystery like Zodiac or charisma like Bundy. His legacy is uglier, more bureaucratic. He's the cautionary tale that criminals don't need brilliance when incompetence will do the work for them. His story doesn't fascinate. It indicts. It forces us to ask whether our systems are built to protect or just to function until they fail. The aftermath of Kenneth McDuff is not just that he killed, it's that he was allowed to keep killing. And that truth, that bitter, bureaucratic truth, is more frightening than any shadow in a parking lot. There's a cruel irony in Kenneth McDuff's story. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't particularly cunning. He wasn't even charming. He was, in many ways, a dull man, crude, arrogant, driven by urges that were as basic as they were destructive. And yet, that dullness carved a path of devastation across Texas. Not because he was unstoppable, but because he was enabled. Think about it. McDuff's greatest accomplice wasn't Roy Dale Green or any of the hangers-on who feared and followed him. His greatest accomplice was paperwork, bed counts, parole hearings stamped by tired hands. The quiet shrug of the system that decided numbers mattered more than names. That's the real horror. A killer didn't outweed the law. The law tripped over itself and opened the door for him. We like to believe monsters are rare, that they're aberrations, freak storms in an otherwise stable sky. But Kenneth McDuff wasn't lightning. He was rot. He was proof that evil doesn't need brilliance when negligence will carry it far enough. And maybe that's why his story lingers, long after the execution chamber silenced him. Because it leaves us staring at ourselves, not just at McDuff's indifference, but at the indifference that let him roam free. He didn't just kill his victims. He revealed the blind spots we all prefer not to see. So here's the final image. A broomstick left in the dirt, a symbol of his cruelty, yes, but also of something worse. A reminder that while one man strangled a life out of innocence, an entire system strangled their chances of protection. And if that doesn't make you uneasy, if that doesn't gnaw at you long after the story ends, then maybe you're not paying close enough attention. Because Kenneth McDuff wasn't just a killer. He was a mirror, and what he showed us about justice in America is far harder to bury than he ever was. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.